Happy Sabbath, GHAF. Last week when Matt did the intro, he had this great podcast setup with the fancy mic. I'm kind of jealous I don't have that setup, but here we go. When I recorded the first intro several weeks ago, it's been 12 or 13 weeks actually, I don't think any of us expected it to go on this long. I know I didn't. And as it's worn on, after a time, I suspect that we all began to feel like this. Our world has been turned upside down. There have been frustrations, fear, inconveniences, and unknowns. And yet, there have hopefully been some upsides, some slowing down, more time with family, maybe more exercise, more reading, more learning, more prayer. I was listening to a podcast a few weeks ago that was talking about not looking back when this is over and regretting how you spent your time and energy. This sermon series that we've been listening to by Pastor Mirkovich has been one of stimulating us to learn and to possibly think differently, to consider building a new normal for how we view and interact as the church within the world. Hopefully you and we collectively are learning together, and that we'll look back and say that this was one outcome of the crisis that we're glad that we experienced and learned from. In this upcoming sermon, Pastor Mirkovich doesn't do a recap at the beginning, so I thought it would be valuable to share a summary of some of the big themes that he's discussed over the previous 4 sermons as I've picked up on them. So to review, the first sermon was about the word ecclesia, and translated as being the church, as being those called out, not the building, but the body. And the church as the elect, which is not as some special privilege, but as a special vocation. The church acting as God's agents, as citizens of God's kingdom, pushing back against the realm of death, pain, and suffering. The gates of Hades cannot withstand the church. And the idea of not letting the church become the end result for itself. Then in Out of Ur, he reminded us that God was blessing Abraham so that he and his heirs could bless the world, and that we, as Abraham's spiritual heirs, are to bless others as well. In Out of Egypt, he presented the idea of representing God and participating in rescue, versus the idea of falling into a Stockholm Syndrome relationship with the hostage taker of this world. The idea of not falling back into the comfort of our past or current dysfunctions, or being fearful of moving forward into God's ways or the doors that he opens for us. In this last one, Out of Babylon, the concept of shalom as restoration, reconciliation, forgiveness, other-centered love, generosity, and hospitality. And in living out that shalom, even in environments that may be uninviting or unfriendly, the desiring of goodness for the people and the communities around us, seeking their welfare and their prosperity and their healing. And the idea of doing so by living in a faithful presence, acting out God's ways with God's presence, with his empowering spirit, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in accommodation to Satan's secular ways, and sometimes in resistance to them. And now, the next talk we're about to hear is about culture. What is culture? How people generally engage with culture, and how the church might respond and interact with culture. We'll keep learning together, and we'll try to evolve into a new normal for how we interact with the world. We hope you find it interesting. Enjoy the talk, and happy Sabbath.
There All right, we've been in the middle of a sermon series entitled Church, the Medium is the Message. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through a review, but we're going to dive into part 5 here today. As humans, we make stuff. We make stuff, and we like making stuff. We find stuff all around us, and when we find that stuff all around us, we make something out of it. It's part of what it means to be human. Part of what it means to be human is to encounter the world around us. And as we encounter it, and we begin to make sense of it, its smells, its sounds, its food, the raw materials all around us. We encounter these raw materials, these rhythms and these melodies, concrete mixed with water to make brick. We encounter things and we begin to play with them, and our imaginations come alive. Sometimes, like in China, they make great walls. They make walls, and these walls extend, and they're big, and they're amazing. And this wall speaks to the way in which the people who made it envisioned the world around them. It spoke to what it meant to be a Chinese person at that time in China. Other times, we encounter things and we say we need to make doors. I'm not much of a modelist. Who's laughing at me? Who was that? Doors. Blobs. Sometimes we realize we need handles on those doors. But we make stuff. We encounter stuff. And as we encounter it, we begin to make something of the world. And something about our human experience comes alive when we encounter the world around us, and we choose to take that potato that came out of the ground, and that onion that came out of the ground, and that mushroom that grew on that tree, and we combine them, and we make something new. I don't know how well my door is going to survive here. But we make stuff. We make stuff about the world around us. As we encounter the world around us, as we encounter the raw materials of life, we are sort of wired to take those things into our hands, into our ears, into our mouths, put them on our bodies, combine this article of clothing with this color, put it in this pocket, poof it up in just the right way. And we make stuff of everything we encounter. This is what the world calls culture. Culture. How would you define culture? What is culture? What is that thing that we all talk about when we talk about culture? We sometimes say things like, oh, he seems so cultured. When we say that somebody's cultured, what do we mean? Does that mean that they go to museums? That they go to the VSO, the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra? What does it mean to be cultured? What does it mean to have culture? Everybody has culture. This organization has culture. Oak Ridge has culture. Everything we encounter, these buildings, these are cultural artifacts. They tell us something about the way the world was. They tell us something about the way the world is, the way that we want the world to be. Every time we encounter something, we say, this potato cut this way, rolled in this way with these ingredients, we're making something. We're making something new, and this is what it means to be human, and this is what it means to encounter the world around us. We create culture. Early on, this is a picture of a drawing in a cave. It didn't take very long for humans to recognize the need to express themselves. And these are cave drawings. These are early expressions as writing utensils and other such things were being developed, and people were creating inks, and they would take dried fruit and they would pulverize it into a powder, and they'd make all kinds of colors from the reds and the yellows and the oranges that they would encounter. All the things that they could find, they realized they could make paint. And then they realized that they took the guts of an animal and they dried it and they stretched it out and they put it over a piece of wood with a hole in it, they could have a stringed instrument. Humans constantly are encountering the world, encountering the various tangible things, and they're making something. Next slide, please. This is the Great Wall of China. It too is a cultural artifact. It too tells us something about the way the creators of this wall wanted the world to be, and the way in which they saw the world, what it was, and the potential that it could have if they could just make something. In this case, a wall. Next slide, please. Music. Everybody that loves music understands culture. Take that note with that rhythm, combine it with this note, and you have rhythm, melody, and harmony, and all of a sudden you've got a song. You've got something new. And you've created something just from sounds and vibrations, and you've created an entirely new experience for everybody. This is what we call culture. Next slide, please. Anybody know what that is? Anybody? I think it's some kind of a fancy ratatouille. How many of you love the movie Ratatouille? I love that movie. But you see that? A little bit of zucchini, a little bit of potato, some sauce, and now not just combined, but we've got to put it on the plate a certain way, and we've got to combine it with a dollop of whatever that creamy looking thing on the top is. We create things, we express things, and all of these things we call culture. But culture is not just tangible artifacts. Culture also at times expresses itself in ideas. We say democracy, or we say communism. And both words, communism and democracy, carry with them an entire culture. They carry with them an entire worldview. What does it mean to live in a democracy? When we hear that word, we experience culture. We experience a vision of the world and the way the world should be. Certain values that underlie that idea. Likewise, communism. We hear the word communism, and it too communicates a culture. It communicates a people group and a way in which they think, and the ways in which they think dictate the way in which they interact with each other, the ways they interact with people above them in the hierarchies, the way they interact with people below them in the hierarchies. It sometimes even communicates hierarchy. Ideas in culture are loaded. They are everywhere. We cannot escape culture. The pews you sit on, the carpets we sit on, the things we wear, the things we eat, the things we dress, it is all culture. Next slide, please. Even protests. Even those moments when we speak up and a brand new idea to us captures our heart in a way that an idea has never captured our heart before. Now follow me, church. Follow me. We've been in the middle of a sermon series about the church and what does it mean to be the church and what does it mean to create something, for God to have called people out, called Abraham out of Ur, called the Israelites out of Egypt. He called them out of Babylon, and at the various stages in this progression of creating something new, it anticipates the view of the way the world is. And it anticipates a view of the way the world should be. Ever bought a new house? Ever moved into a new apartment? And you walk into that apartment, you walk into that house and you say, these walls won't do, not in this color. No, it needs the newest, fanciest gray color. Paired with a feature wall. Are feature walls still in? I don't really know, I'm not an interior designer, but it needs to be plum. and I need to put this piece of artwork here with this leather couch here with this side table here and this lamp here, and it's going to communicate to the people the way that I view my house and my world. Next slide. Culture is what we make of the world that we encounter. Culture is that moment when humanity realizes that they create the places and spaces and ideas in which either humans flourish or they don't. And sometimes you walk into a family and we say, what a dysfunctional family. Or we walk into a church and we say, what a dysfunctional church. Or we walk into a business and we say, what a dysfunctional business. Or we walk into a government or a country and we say, what a backwards, dysfunctional country. What we're commenting there is we're commenting on the fact that the way in which the culture works, the relationships intertwine, the things they create, whether they're banking systems, which are cultural artifacts, or their artistic systems, or their educational systems, everything we do is an act of culture. And it either communicates what was and how it needs to be. All of these things are the things we do as we create. However, next slide. As humans, but particularly now as the Christian church, we find ourselves in the world. We share the same space, the same raw materials that everybody else faces, and God has called us to a task. He's called us to the task of making the church. This new vision of what life can be like. The same raw materials, people. We're all people. Every organization, every church, every denomination, every business, every family has the same raw material, people. People with eyes, ears, mouth, and nose, for the most part, and I'm not trying to discriminate against anybody that may have been born differently abled. But by and large, we encounter the same raw materials, and those same raw materials, given a different set of hands and a different perception, creates something entirely different. And so Jesus encounters the world. He enters the world, and he encounters the same raw materials that Caesar encountered. Who? Caesar, the leader of what? Rome. Rome was this entire culture of power. Rome was this entire culture of how things needed to work. They built these big, gigantic freeway systems, and they expanded their empire. They had a view of the way the world is, and they created the culture of the Roman Empire, and they had the same raw materials. The people and ideas and words and language, they had all of the same things, but yet the vision of what Jesus wanted to create versus what Caesar wanted to create were entirely different. What do you do with the raw materials you find in life? Some of you know that I like to chef it up a little bit. And I'll never forget the day that I kind of, for the first time, sort of dove into a green curry, like a really good green curry. And new flavors. I grew up in an Eastern European home where we would eat lots and lots of parsley. Parsley's a raw material, and we put parsley, we called it persun, in everything. In everything. Didn't matter what we ate, my mom put parsley in it. It's a strong flavor. You guys know what parsley is? It's a curly, dark green. It should really be just like the side portion of a dish, but some cultures, entire salads, like tabbouleh salads, are made with parsley. And so I grew up really liking this dark green flavor. It was a raw material, and my mom, in her culture making, put it everywhere. And then the first time I tried cilantro, another dark green leafy little thing that creates all kinds of flavor, I was like, how have I been missing this all my life? It was this new cultural horizon. All of a sudden, a whole new world of flavors opened up to me. And because of that encounter with something new, this new raw material that I hadn't seen before, a new world of cuisine opened up before me. And this is what Jesus came to show them. Jesus came to this earth and he walked this journey with these people, and he said, listen, you've been living in the prevalent culture of the day, the Roman culture. And here's what Rome tells you about your value, about your neighbor's value, about the role of violence, and here's how the economy needs to work, and here's how taxes need to work, and here's your role in the greater Roman culture. That's what Jesus was kind of walking that journey with them. And as he encountered the world, to sort of build off where we were last week, where Daniel, he would accommodate at times and he would resist at times, Jesus sort of said, I have a different vision of how we can take the same raw materials, ideas, power, people, food, tables, places, spaces, all the same materials. But we're going to create something entirely new. Because I believe this is what the world should be like. So as he was departing, as his crucifixion was coming, he too called his disciples forward. We already started there, all the way back in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, when we were studying together the outset of the church, the very first sermon. 5 weeks ago, I stood up here and we preached from that passage, and Jesus says, you, the church, the ecclesia, the called out ones, I'm going to build something entirely new on you and these ideas. And he began to tell them ideas about the divine, about the spiritual, about the places and spaces, the temples, the Pharisees, all of the same raw materials. And he reinterpreted them and he put them in different orders in different places. And he said, because of all of this work, we're going to have a completely different experience. I had a church member in my last church that was really good at this. We did this little outreach activity that we called Home Team. And Home Team was an opportunity to sort of bless a family in our neighborhood who owned a house, but for whatever reasons, generally health-related reasons or tragedy, like somebody died, a mother would die or a father would die or something, and they had to kind of fallen on hard financial times, and they wouldn't be able to kind of upkeep their house, and maybe several years had gone by, and tarps were on roofs, and there was all sorts of damage, and there was mold, and there was electrical issues, and the kitchens would start to fall in disrepair. And we'd walk into a space. And this elder was able to sort of sit there. And all of a sudden he would envision walls moving and fireplaces and different carpets and different kitchens. And he was able to sort of sit there and sort of know what it would take to move everything around, restore everything. Same raw materials, kitchen cupboards, sinks, washing machines, carpets, paint on walls, all the same raw materials. But the end product had a completely different vision of the value of that human family. And so he would begin to work, and we'd work with all these other businesses, and they would bring their raw materials, wires and plumbing and piping, and in a span of 7 to 10 days, we'd take the very same things that were already there, but the end product was entirely different. It was a new experience. You'd walk into the home during the reveal, right? It was just like Ty Pennington's Extreme Home Repair, Extreme House Makeover, or whatever that show on the HGTV network was called. This elder was inspired by that, and we would sit there and we'd walk into a home in disrepair, and we'd say, wow, what was the culture here? What happened? What was the world like? And what do we want it to be like? And that's what Jesus said. Jesus said, listen, you guys are in the world. You're in the world, and being in the world means you assume certain things about the way the raw material should work. So you kind of look around you and you say, oh, okay, all of this sort of works like this. And you may have lost your ability to envision using those things in different ways. Have you ever sat there, like I kind of sat there today? I had thought long and hard all week long, what would I create? And when Rhoda gave me her Play-Doh, I said, I could just make an orange. Because I lack that kind of creativity. And I said, I'll just, make some balls, like could be, I have a lacrosse ball that looks like this, could be an orange, but you make things. And then I thought, maybe I'll just make squares, and maybe it's like a block of cheddar, like cheddar cheese. And you sort of, you run out of ideas pretty quick, and different people can take different cultural artifacts and make something of them. And that's what Jesus did. Jesus knew. Jesus as the originator of all, mark my words here, zero in here, tweetable. Jesus as the originator of all the raw materials could speak into what he knew the vision for those materials always was. Always was. So he's with his disciples and he says, listen, Rome is telling you, the prevalent culture is telling you certain things about the way the world should be, about the way you should use things. Just like my mom believes that cilantro should go in nothing, but parsley should go in everything. It's a certain belief about the way the world should operate. And Jesus says, listen, there's all of these things out there, and I am opening the horizon as to how you will treat everything you encounter. Next slide, please. This next portion of the sermon, I am heavily, heavily indebted to this man and to this book. Andy Crouch, for a very long time, was the editor of Christianity Today and has recently become the author of 3 amazing books. This was the very first book he wrote. It has profoundly impacted my perception of what Jesus was doing and what the role of humans are in this world. This book is profound. I highly recommend it to all of you. It's about a decade old now, but it is as relevant to the Christian community today as it was the day it was written. Next slide. So in culture making, Andy unpacks these various postures that all of humanity has towards culture, and then he begins to sort of break it down for us as it sort of is relevant to the church and what the church is doing in the world. How does the church sort of respond to culture? So he says all of humanity, by and large, their number one posture towards culture is to consume it. So you go to the store and you buy the record. You buy that cultural artifact and you put it on your record player, or you download the song off iTunes and you take that music and you simply consume it. Or you go to the store and you take that jar of marmalade and you put it in your basket and you go home with that cultural artifact, that marmalade with its specific spice mix and level of sugar and its labeling, etc. And you say, that marmalade over that marmalade needs to be in my basket. And you go home and you consume it. And you sit here as a congregation today largely as a consumer of a cultural good, a sermon. This sermon assumes certain things about Vancouver, about the congregation, about the way church operates, teaching, the value of preaching the Bible, the value of turning our focus back towards Jesus. There are many things that this cultural good does, and you are by and large sitting here as consumers of a cultural good. So that's the first posture. It's the most prevalent posture that we all take towards any cultural good. We consume it. Next slide. Sometimes we see something like, let's say you're an ancient person and your neighbor, agricultural neighbor to the right, seems to have developed a new tool that makes unearthing all of his carrots easier. And you say, what has he got in his hands? What is she using over there? Look at that thing. It makes digging up all those carrots easier. You know how many more carrots we could grow if we had that tool? And then you go home and you say, I have those same raw materials. What has she got? Some iron, some wood. It's bent this way, etc. I can make that. And we go back and we make that same cultural good. Right? And that's sometimes what you hear, you know, there's this whole theory that everything is simply copycat, right? You hear a guitar player play a certain riff, and you don't even realize that you've kind of heard it, and then you go back and you play something, and you're like, oh, look at this riff I wrote. But it's really actually very similar to what you'd heard just a little while ago. Same thing on the piano, same thing with art, same thing with building houses. You see somebody, you say, wow, I really like their house. If I ever build a house, I'm going to do something similar. Have you ever said that? You see a cultural good and you say, I'm going to do something similar. I'm going to copy it. So humans, they consume culture all the time, and then sometimes when they see a good idea or a good cultural artifact or something that they want to then they say, oh, I'm going to copy that. I'm going to make more of these. In fact, I think I can do it better. And that's what business is all about. Business is saying, I can make that same thing for cheaper and higher quality, and I'm going to sell it better than everybody else. So they copy it. Okay, next slide. Then there are the cultural critics, where we consume, maybe we copy, but really what we like to do is sit back in our armchair and say, you know what, that song sucks, or that movie's amazing, or that dish lacked salt, or that carpet doesn't go with that wall color. We critique. We say, you know what, that head on that animation was too big, it should have been smaller. And we sit and we critique culture. We say, you know what, if I was OAC, I'd get rid of these awful wooden pews and I'd put soft chairs instead. You're critiquing a cultural artifact. It's okay. It's all right to think critically about things. You might have sat here this morning and thought, oh, that music was way too loud. Like, why are they playing it so loud? That's a critique. You are consuming, you are sort of sitting in that cultural world, and you're saying, I like it, I don't like it, I would do this, I wouldn't do that. But here's the problem. Most of the time, critics are just that, critics. They're not actually in the arena. You think the music was too loud today? Why don't you come up and lead it next week? You think the sermon sucked? Why don't you come up and preach it next week? You think the food wasn't good, what you just consumed? Why don't you make the meal and host the family next week? We consume, we copy and critique, but we don't want to be in the arena, and we're afraid of jumping into the arena of actually creating something. And sometimes the Christian church is the number one consumer of all the cultural goods around them. In fact, they say, oh, what is the secular movie industry doing? What's the secular sacred divide? We'll talk about that in a future sermon series. But we talked about it a little bit in the last sermon series. But this idea that things are secular or sacred, I actually don't frankly believe that. I think it's all God there somehow, some way. But they have different values, different beliefs about the way the world should be. And the church simply sits there, and we either consume everything that everybody gives us, or we copy it. We say, hey, if our music sounded like U2, everybody will come and our church will be filled. Or we sit there and we critique it. The fourth prevalent major way in which, next slide please, people deal with culture is they condemn it. Just out of hand. The way my mother dealt with cilantro. Condemn, like, this should be in no food ever. Just total condemnation. Doesn't suit my palate. Yeah, you can just condemn something. You can say, churches should never not have high roofs. And if you walk into a church that doesn't have a high roof, you simply condemn it. You say, man, these people weren't thinking about the grandeur of God when they built this building, because why is it not big? Well, you know, lots of churches, if you go to Europe, they have really high ceilings, and those high ceilings were always sort of to communicate to us where God was. God was up, and so we made it look big and vast so that we'd see the bigness and vastness of God. And so you might have sort of not realized that you had sort of imbibed and inculcated that culture. And so when you encounter a different cultural vision, somebody who took the same raw materials and is trying to make a room for worship, and they build the room for worship in a different way, you might sit back and say, well, that's not how I anticipated this room for worship should look like. And you simply condemn it. You critique it, say, this is wrong. So these four postures are the main postures that we all take. And at different times, Jesus did all of these things. And at different times, you're going to do all of these things. You're going to consume, copy, critique, and condemn. And there is good and right times for all of those things. Can you think of a good time to condemn culture? Of course. Of course, when Nelson Mandela sat in South Africa, in apartheid South Africa, and he said, you know what, this culture of white versus black and this oppression, this South African culture stands in need of condemnation. And let me tell you, there were times in Jesus' ministry, just go read Matthew 23, where he very, very clearly condemns culture. He condemns the way things happen. Next slide, please. The following are a list of questions. This is a good time to write some notes if you like where this is going and you think this might be helpful for you as you encounter. These are the questions, just in case you're wondering, that dictate to me how I feel about church. So let's go through them one at a time here. Next slide. These are 5 questions that you can ask yourself about any cultural artifact. An orange, a lacrosse ball, a block of cheddar, a ratatouille, a Dyson vacuum cleaner, a Mercedes-Benz car, brick houses versus stick-built houses, you name it. Any cultural artifact, Baroque music versus gangsta rap. Okay? Any cultural artifact that you encounter, you can ask these 5 questions about this cultural thing, and it will begin to help you understand maybe what the creator, now follow me here. If you ask these 5 questions well of whatever cultural artifact you encounter, you will begin to understand what the creator had in mind when they created it. Okay, so question number 1. What does this artifact assume about the way the world is? Okay? So let's just use one. I'm going to take an example from the crowd. We're going to take a cultural artifact. It could be a light bulb. It could be carpet. It could be a window. It could be a kind of music. It could be a piece of art. It could be the way fashion works. Anything. I'm going to take one example from the crowd right now, kind of the first one that I hear really loud. Any cultural artifact, we're going to go through these 5 questions with that artifact. Okay, bow ties. Perfect. Excellent. What does this artifact assume about the way the world is? Okay? So we're talking about bow ties here. Particularly, she said Steve's bow tie. So let's get really specific here. What does this artifact assume about the way the world is? Number 1, it assumes that there is an appropriate way for a man to dress. Okay? So I have inherited collared shirts. Not because collared shirts have any value in and of themselves, but sometimes, somewhere along the line, people were looking at humans and the way they were dressing, and fashion would change. And so the world, we assume, is that there is fashion, that there is a way to dress yourself, to sort of present yourself into the world, maybe sort of fitting into culture, or speaking up against culture, or saying this about culture. Why does he wear bow ties more than he wears regular neckties? You could go a lot of different ways. Number 1, here's what I assume about the world. I think it looks good. I think that there's a way to make yourself appear somebody maybe that kind of understands how to dress themselves in a public venue when you're up front in front of people and live streaming, whatever. I don't know. It assumes some of those things. Okay, next question. We're going to continue going down this world of the bow tie. What does this artifact assume about the way the world should be? Okay, so the way the world is, the way the world should be. Maybe, at sort of a fundamental level, I believe the world should be a well-dressed world. Okay? Simply put, I believe the world should be a well-dressed world, and I believe that bright blue bow ties that you frustratingly tie in front of the mirror like 40 times, and it's still not quite what you want it to be, but you do it anyways. You put on a brave smile and you go to church, and really, it assumes that the world should be a well-dressed world. Okay? It probably assumes a lot of other things. It probably assumes that, I'm more attractive this way. Maybe it assumes that color communicates my character. When I'm not afraid to wear this color blue with this color blue with this color blue, it's like, whoa, this guy's mixing a lot of blues. Either he doesn't know what he's doing or he's really confident. I don't know yet. Okay, next slide. What does this artifact make possible? What does the bow tie make possible? Number 1, it makes bow tie people that create them possible. So you could be a bow tie designer. It makes that possible, right? So neckties of any kind have created that. It also creates a canvas. You could create specific kinds of bow ties. Like I sometimes wear a wooden bow tie. Right? It creates different ways to create bow ties. You can have pre-tied bow ties and bow ties that you need to tie yourself. This artifact also makes it possible to kind of change up one suit coat and wear just like a white shirt, and you can make that white shirt and that white suit coat look different 7 days out of the week just simply through the bow tie that you wear. So it enables you to wear less clothing by buying cheap little articles that you can hang around your neck to make your outfit look fresh. So it makes a lot of things possible. It makes it possible to choke me. Yeah, it makes a lot of things possible. Okay, I need to shut up. Keep moving. Okay, what else? What does this artifact make impossible or more difficult? No, actually, it's really comfortable. You don't even notice them. What does this artifact? It makes a regular necktie impossible for the time being. I mean, I guess I could wear a bow tie and a necktie underneath and start a whole new cultural fashion trend. But I probably don't have the courage to do that, right? So it precludes wearing a normal bow tie. It says, a normal tie, necktie, means I'm not going to wear the one that goes down to my belt. I'm wearing this. It also means that I can't wear my collar open. I couldn't just come up here and kind of open up my collar. So everything we make, whether it's a bicycle, which says, oh, I need to get from A to B like this, but I'm not going to do it, at least in the 21st century, with a big gas-hungry SUV because I'm green Vancouverite, and it's easy to just hop on my bicycle and go that direction. It doesn't matter what the cultural artifact is. You can go through these 5 questions, and as you ask those 5 questions about it, you begin to understand what they're trying to do. Next slide. Last question, what new culture is created in response? That is to say, so somebody encounters a house or they encounter a car, etc. So cars are a perfect example of that. So somebody creates a vehicle, whatever vehicle you have. Let's think of a kind of like a niche market vehicle. I drive one. TDIs. Do you guys know what TDIs are? Turbo diesels. Volkswagen turbo diesels. There's a cult following of turbo diesels. And so what happened was Volkswagen created turbo diesel cars, and a whole nother economy erupted over here of things that you can put in and create for your turbo diesel vehicle. So you can have special, you've often heard me pull in, some of you have seen me drive around, and my car sounds a lot louder than other diesels. Do you know why my car sounds a lot louder than other diesels? Because there's a special tailpipe and a special exhaust system that was created specifically for that car that I was able to install. Okay, so we've gone through that whole thing, but we need to get back to the spiritual world, and we need to get back to Jesus choosing to make a new cultural artifact. He is choosing to make the church. Now, as we go through these 5 questions, put up the next slide. All 5 questions will be on the next slide. Next slide. When we think of the church and we ask ourselves the questions about the church, and that's the point of this whole sermon series, Jesus says you're in but not of the world. So how do you go in through the world and not get stuck in its sort of prevalent cultural ways about the way power should work or anything should work? How do you sort of stand and take those raw materials and create the kind of world that God envisioned? He said, well, I'm going to call the people out, and I'm going to show them that those raw materials of whatever they create can change the world. So just go through these questions. What does this artifact assume about the way the world is? So when Jesus makes the church and he calls the church out and he says, I'm going to give you a new way to handle all these things, what is he saying? He's saying currently there isn't a group that's living this way, right? What does this artifact assume about the way the world is? It assumes that the world needs it. Do you hear me? When Jesus created something totally new, a new cultural phenomenon, a called out people that were going to live his kingdom, and you ask that very first question, what does this artifact assume about the way the world is? That it would benefit from a called out people. That it would benefit from having a cultural influence that is currently absent. What does this artifact assume about the way the world should be? Well, there's raw materials, and there's power, and there's empires, and there's people hurting and brokenness, and it seems like it's only getting more chaotic, and I need to offer an alternative. What does this artifact make possible? The worship of the true God, the worship in shalom and peace, to be a blessing, to take a land, all of those raw materials. Is anybody connecting this to all the 4 sermons that preceded it? He gave Abraham raw material, land. He said, what are you going to make of that land? He gave him raw material, humans. He said, your family is going to be like the sands of the sea. All of these things were raw materials that God was granting to Abraham and granting to Israel. And he's saying, what kind of a culture are you going to make out of it? And so he calls the church out and he says, here's a new vision of what humanity is. Here's a new vision of how to use power. Here's a new vision of what the table can mean and how to share food and all the ways in which you share food and the way you create meals and the way that you drink of the cup. All of these cultural things that you do, they communicate to the world the way that you envision the world. What does it make possible? It makes an alternative world possible. What does it make impossible or more difficult? Well, if you're staring your enemy in the face and you take this new cultural phenomenon of loving your enemy, well, it makes hating them impossible. It makes hating them more difficult. And then what new kinds of cultures are created in response? All kinds of things. People are inspired by God and they create new things into this world. Next slide. This was the take-home point, and this is the take-home point of the whole sermon. This is it right here. The church assumes that the world can be, when Jesus called the church out, there was an assumption that the world could be a different place. And here's the kicker. The only way to change culture is to make more of it. We think that by critiquing, by condemning, by copying, and by consuming, that we are changing the world. If I just yell loud enough that that music sucks, that it's going to change the world. No, when people sat there in communism and they said communism sucks, the only way to change the world was to create a new culture, to break down the wall in Berlin and to break down everything and to step into a new culture. The only way to change the world, to change the predominant culture, is not to condemn, critique, consume, copy. It's to look at it all, say all the raw materials and say, no, I'm going to step into a new existence. And that's what Jesus did. He looked at the world around him and he said, you know, I could yell at the Pharisees till they're blue in the face to change their religious ways. I could scream at Caesar to stop using power in the way that he's using power. And I could just condemn and critique all day long. Or I could tell my church to copy it and just say, well, if Caesar uses the sword, you use the sword. If you know, they offer that for consumption, you consume it. If they offer you these things, just consume, just copy, you know, you could just kind of scream at them in protest. But that's not what God does. That's not what Jesus does. Jesus arrives on the scene and he says, here's the raw materials, here's everything. I'm going to create something entirely new. The only way to change the world is to create more of it. Next slide. So these are some better responses. So if there's 4 predominant responses, these are the 2 responses that Andy Crouch in his book, Culture Making, calls the Christian church back to. And he says, you must cultivate and create. You must cultivate and create. What is the act of cultivation? Next slide, please. The next slide. What is the call to cultivate? How many of you remember Matthew chapter 5 and Jesus is preaching to a big group of people on the side of a hill? We call it the Sermon on the Mount. And he's sort of giving his vision of what the world could be like and how people can encounter the world. And he says, listen, you guys, I'm calling you out to be salt and light. Salt is this ability, I believe, as I sort of extrapolated, this ability to cultivate something. What does it mean to cultivate? Can anybody give me a working definition of the word cultivate? To change, yeah. To cultivate is to look at something and say, if I do this and this and this piece of music, or this kind of thing, I can create it and nurture it and make it become what it really needs to become. So you kind of see a piece of dirt, you know, and it's covered with weeds, and it's got like a weird bush in the middle there, and nothing seems to really make sense. It's not kind of working together. And you say, man, if I just clear all of that out and I cultivate it, and I plant this carefully over here and this carefully over here, I can have a veritable vegetable garden. That's what cultivation is. Cultivation is to hear the sounds, the tastes, the buildings, the walls, the power, everything that the earth has to offer, all the raw materials, and to say, yeah, so I can use metal and gunpowder and all of these things to create missiles, but that's not what I want to cultivate. I don't want to cultivate killing machines. I don't want to take steel and build guns. That's not what I'm cultivating. I'm going to take steel and build what? You name it. What can the church do to change the world? You cultivate something totally different with the same raw materials. And that's what Jesus said. There was this whole earth, and Caesar and Rome were trying to make something of the world. And they said, okay, you people, you do this. And they were cultivating a culture. And Jesus says, no, you guys as salt, you're going to take the same things and you're going to make a new vision, something entirely new. And then he says, be a light on the hill and shine into the darkness. Next slide. Something happened, however. Something happened when the church went off the rails. And I'm saying this, it might be kind of in really intensified over the last 100 years. But this Christian subculture, what are subcultures? Does anybody know what a subculture is? Anybody know what a subculture is? Anybody? Subculture is saying, oh, if I wear, some people say I belong to the hipster subculture. Anybody know what hipsters are? They wear boots, they wear tight jeans, and they wear bow ties, okay? And if you wear boots, tight jeans, and bow ties, you belong to the hipster culture. And it's a lot more than that. But it's sort of like this thing that exists alongside of all these other cultures. And this is what Christianity basically kind of missed the boat. God had called the church not to be a subculture, but to create more culture, and that culture would become so infused in everything that the world was doing that the whole world wanted to buy into it, not to create a safe bubble for Christians to exist. So that's what we've done. We've created a safe subculture, and we have entire categories. Christian music. Whatever happened to just music? Church clothes. Whatever happened to just clothes? Church activities. Whatever happened to just activities? Short-term church mission trips. Whatever happened to just service? We created an entire subculture, and everybody just sort of gets to watch us from a distance. Oh, look at what they're doing over there. And nobody's invited into the new reality. Next week is entirely, the whole sermon is about why did we create a subculture that nobody knows what it's about, and it's kind of like just this oddball thing that we watch from a distance and say, what are the Christians doing over there? God never intended for us just to create a subculture. He intended for us to create an entirely new culture that would be in the world, but not of the world. But we're not even in the world. We're in our own little nuclear bunker. Nobody knows what we're creating. And heaven forbid we do anything that doesn't include the name Jesus. Heaven forbid you're a filmmaker that doesn't want to make blatantly Christian films. Heaven forbid you're a music maker that doesn't make worship music. Heaven forbid that you are an architect that's not building churches. But you can see how this subculture thinks. So next slide. Next slide. No more Christian subculture. OAC is not creating a Christian subculture. We're not creating an OAC subculture. There's not Adventist culture and then OAC culture. No, we believe that what we're offering to the Adventist church, what we're offering to the world, what we're offering everywhere is not meant to be just OAC's small little cultural thing that we're doing over here. It's meant to say we actually believe, here's our little cultural artifact, humbly we offer it to you, world. Humbly we offer it to you, Adventist church. Humbly we offer it to ourselves. Humbly we consume it, we critique it, we copy it, we cultivate it, we create it. We are engaged in the act of making culture. This is what Jesus did. He has called us to be engaged in the act of making culture and to make it available to all at all times, because we have a vision of the way the world should exist, not the way OAC or the Adventist Church alone should exist, or the way Christianity should exist, or the way Western religions should exist. No, Jesus wasn't coming to start a Western religion or a denomination or a little building or a small little group of believers. He was coming to change the world. And if we're not in the world, we're changing nothing but ourselves. It's a gigantic adventure in missing the point. Next slide. The only way to change you was to reshape and remake you. I'm going to try to build something here. My last little thing. Can you fast forward to the last slide? I think it's the next one anyways. Forgive me, this is going to be a little bit harder to create. This is pretty soft Play-Doh. Okay, we're going to try, people. Here we go, okay. Nobody take offense to this cross. Whoa. Okay, we got to prop it up. Here was the worst of Rome's culture. A cultural artifact, the cross. It assumed something about the way the world should be. Insurrectionists should be stapled to one of these. It assumed that the world built on fear and the shame of being on a cross on a public hill called Golgotha would stop any future person in trying to suggest that maybe there was a better way to use the raw materials than the way Rome was. What? You think there's a better way to tax? We'll put you on the cross. The cross was the worst of what Roman culture could offer. It was ignominious death. It was that moment in time where all of Rome would sort of scoff and say, look at what that person tried to do. They tried to create something new. They tried to start a church. They tried to change the world. They tried to communicate something about how power operates, about the value of people, about ethics and morals. No. We're gonna put you on a tree. You want to change our religion, Jesus? Don't you dare change our religion. We're going to put you on a cross. But it was a cultural artifact. Cultural artifact. And Jesus said, no, I'm going to change that raw material. And that raw material now is no longer going to stand for what it stood for in the Roman realm. Hear me? In the Roman realm, this meant that you were a horrible person. But as he took in that raw material and he laid himself there and he created something that now hangs around the neck of so many people, he created an entirely new way to respond to that cultural artifact. Now, rather than being a source of shame and guilt, it is for an entire movement on this planet, the very hope of heaven. This is the belief that you can take the same raw materials and completely transform them into a life-changing phenomenon. It's your belief that submitting to the authorities rather than fighting back is the way of the world. That's what the cross communicates. It communicates that you can take the very source of death, suffering, and pain, and you can transform it. You can cultivate it. You can create an entirely new culture. That's what Jesus did. He took the worst of what Rome had to offer, and rather than just standing there in condemnation, sorry, I'm really self-conscious about this cross. Rather than taking and just condemning, he took that cultural artifact and he transformed it into something entirely so we can take the things that we find as a church, the world that we find, the homes and houses, all the various things that we find around us, and we can take those things and we can create new things. This is the act of making culture. If we want to change the world, and we do, if we want to change ourselves, and we do, if we want to be supportive to the change that others are undergoing, and we do, if we want to take the crosses of 21st century Vancouver and transform them into sources of hope, and we do, we have to learn to step off of the consumption train, the copying train, the critiquing train, and the condemning train. And we need to find ourselves in the cultivating and creating worlds where we creatively understand all the raw materials that we find can come together in such a way that we envision the world as a place of kindness, as a place of support, as a place of transformation, as a place of growth, as a place of taking brokenness and making it whole, as a place of taking all of those cracks and filling them with love. This is what the church is called to do, to take the raw materials of the earth, those original materials. When Jesus told Adam and Eve, go and make something of the world, he told us to go and make something of the world. When Jesus told the church to be in but not of, what he said is those raw materials, the empire uses them like this, and the religions of the day use them like this, but I'm suggesting you use them like this.
Come set your rule and reign in our hearts again. Increase in us, we pray. Unveil why we're made. Come set our hearts ablaze with hope, like why